Chapter 2. It all started with a microphone. Actually, it all started with the Greeks, or some say. The ancient Greeks were known for many contributions to Western civilization. Among them were the use of public forums and amphitheaters for a variety of purposes, including speeches, debates, theater, and oratory. But once a lot of people assemble into a single forum or amphitheater, one quickly discovers the need to increase the volume of one's voice. They dealt with this issue in 5th century BC Greece by developing theater masks with horn-shaped mouth openings that amplified the voice of the actor using the mask. It ended up looking like a customized megaphone. Essentially, it was a microphone. Throughout history, we have examples of how this communication technology developed and the impacts it has made on our social interactions. In 1665, the English physicist Robert Hooke invented the lover's telephone, which was made of a stretched wire with a cup attached to each end. Many kids called this a tin can telephone. In 1861, the German inventor Johann Philipp Reis developed a sound transmitter. That system was later refined by Alexander Graham Bell, which used a liquid transmitter whereby the diaphragm was attached to a conductive rod in an acid solution. All of these technologies transmitted the human voice from one place and in one form to another. The 1870s brought the invention of the carbon microphone, developed independently by David Edward Hughes and Thomas Edison. The carbon microphone is basically the early prototype of today's microphones. That prototype became the microphone used in a first-ever radio broadcast in 1910, and one that featured a performance in the New York Metropolitan Opera House. There have been massive advancements in the technology since then, especially with the advent of radio and television, both in production and in consumer engagement. Today, microphones are used wherever sound needs to be picked up and converted into an electrical format. Microphones are an essential part of any audio recording system. The microphone picks up the sound and converts it into electrical energy that can then be processed by electronic amplifiers and audio processing systems. Radio. In 1886, the German physicist Heinrich Hertz identified a type of electromagnetic radiation that could carry information across space, from one place to another. Radio waves. About a decade later, the first practical radio transmitters were developed by the Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi. A few short years later, radio began to be used commercially. As part of a test designed to determine how far radio waves could travel, Marconi in 1901 conducted his historic experiment that transmitted the first radio signal from southern England to the appropriately named Signal Hill, located in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. The existence of microphones and radio transmission naturally opened the realm of broadcasting, which is essentially the transmission of audio information along the radio wave spectrum of radio receivers. It all sounds very complicated, but most homes in the commercial market eventually acquired a radio receiver, or, more simply termed, a radio. Someone sitting in a studio in any given city or town could speak and deliver a message to an audience situated in their own homes, provided that the home featured a radio receiver. An interesting dimension about radio waves: while just about anyone with the appropriate equipment could start broadcasting to an audience of listeners, the waves themselves are shared by many users. Two or more radio transmitters in the same area attempting to transmit signals, let's say a radio program, on the same frequency, will end up interfering with each other. Radio interference resulted in poor reception, with a host of implications for other signals transmitted over radio waves, including air traffic controls or emergency communications, for example. In stepped national governments to control, organize, and coordinate the airwaves, as well as, in some instances, the content produced. We see these early attempts at regulation continuing in the form of the Federal Communication Commission of the United States the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission in Canada, and the British Broadcasting Corporation in the United Kingdom. A fascinating aside, the BBC's original enabling license extended from the UK's General Post Office, which had original control of the airwaves because they had been interpreted under law as an extension of the Post Office's services. Radio today has many frequencies, including AM, or amplitude modulation, and its associated shortwave bands, FM, or frequency modulation, which includes very high frequency, or VHF, as well as broadband, digital audio, and satellite. Typically, someone or some organization wishing to send out programs, messages, or other broadcasts would receive a license from a regulator to send their signal out on a specified location in a designated frequency. Pirate radio. Originally, as one can imagine, the field of radio prior to the entrance of governments and public policy was wide open to amateurs and hobbyists. In some jurisdictions, the amateurs were not banned but given their own frequency spectrum. One should also be aware that naval communications once relied heavily on the use of radio waves, for communications and radio monitoring, for example. So any interference could have been catastrophic, especially during times of international conflict or war. Limiting the hobbyists to a dedicated spectrum was seen as a suitable measure to alleviating problems associated with interference. One might even say that, if not for the navies of the world, coordinated regulation, licensing, and compliance measures of radio frequencies might today look very different. Naval necessities gave way to your favorite radio station? Yes, in a roundabout way. The role of navies provides an appropriate segue to our next topic: pirates. Pirate radio surfaced as an issue when frequencies were hijacked, which was known as wave piracy. Another form of so-called piracy occurred when unlicensed broadcasters based their operations offshore and outside the jurisdiction of national governments, at times on an anchored vessel or marine platform. Free radio is another term that has been used interchangeably, particularly in the context of clandestine, unauthorized, and unlicensed transmissions. So basically, if a broadcaster took the airwaves in an unauthorized way, or transmitted content that didn't follow a government's rules, they often fell within the category of pirate radio. Technical requirements and equipment for establishing a pirate radio operation are not dissimilar to those of authorized and licensed broadcasters. Startup and maintenance costs can be substantial. Despite their differences, early radio and pirate radio both have some similarities to podcasts and podcasters, which will be explored in later sections of this book. Amateur or ham radio. Pirate radio is of the unlicensed and unauthorized kind. Amateur or ham radio is both licensed and authorized. Ham radio is non-commercial and is often used as a hobby or for personal training. The broadcasting activity of these radio amateurs is licensed, and it is limited to the use of small frequency bands. Globally, it's estimated that more than 2 million people are actively engaged in ham radio operations, often associated through regionally based clubs. Ham operators are required to comply with national and international codes and regulations. The term ham derives from the pejorative description given to those operators who, it was thought, lacked ability. However, the term has since evolved into one of a badge of honor by amateur operators who have adopted the term as their very own moniker, which is an interesting example in branding. While equipment and technical requirements can be modest, it is more common that the physical setup of an amateur or ham operator resembles that of a professional, commercial studio. A more than introductory degree of technical know-how is required, and costs for setting up a ham radio operation, including annual licensing fees in some jurisdictions, can be prohibitive for many. Despite the technical requirements and compliance measures, ham radio enables that person with something to say to be able to turn on the system and start transmitting his or her message through the microphone. Certainly, some interesting similarities to podcasting. Internet radio. The medium has been referred to variously as net radio, online radio, streaming, and webcasting. Unlike other forms of radio, transmission via the Internet does not require a broadcast license. While the content may be similar to broadcast radio or any of its variants, Internet radio is actually not a broadcast. This medium is not wireless or reliant on radio waves. Rather, it transmits from a computer and is typically available to any listener with Internet or app access. Nearly all traditional broadcast radio stations have a mirrored online presence. These entities are already licensed and regulated, and they typically extend their compliance requirements to their online sites. While this allows any user anywhere to listen to the broadcast content of a given radio station, this is not by definition Internet radio. Aside from the absence of licensing requirements, the regulation of Internet radio rarely extends beyond customary website regulation, for example, privacy, copyright, or accessibility. This is the key feature that frees content producers on Internet radio to virtually do as they please, to create their own formats, playlists, points of discussion, whether profane or safe for work. It's this quality and spirit of freedom that puts Internet radio in a similar vein as pirate or ham radio. It is also a quality that defines and is echoed in the world of podcasting. Radio over the Internet started in the early 1990s with the launch of Internet Talk Radio by Carl Malamud. In 1995, Scott Bourne created netradio.com, the first Internet-only radio network. In 1997, Real Audio entered the picture, and these folks facilitated enhanced streaming accessibility as well as broadening the technology to deliver multiple formats. Keep in mind that this was developing during the early days of the dot-com boom. The user-listener experience was almost exclusive to the desktop or laptop computer. The smartphone would not impact user and listener behavior until well into the 2000s. Although Internet radio is not regulated in the same ways as traditional broadcast radio, some of the biggest challenges for these stations are royalty and webcaster fees. In the early 2000s, Internet Talk Radio was blossoming. It opened the opportunities for content producers to say what they wanted, however they wanted to say it. The need for technical knowledge was not as great as had been the case for other previous forms of radio. However, the webcasting fees, that is, paying to have your program housed on a server or streamed, were the challenging part. Additionally, as attractive as the Internet is, particularly in the early commercial use days, the challenge was identifying, locating, and retaining a listener base. The feed, RSS, arrives. The issues of identifying, locating, and retaining a listener base echo the challenges of content promotion. How does one minimize the chaos in the vastness of the digital universe and make the content work? RSS feeds were one of those answers in the realm of voice transmission. An RSS, or really simple syndication, is a web feed that allows users to access updates to websites in a standardized, computer-readable format. The process of an RSS feed, the sharing or passing of content, is called web syndication. News aggregators have been common with RSS feeds for many years. A news aggregator automatically checks RSS feeds for new and updated content published online. The information is then passed from website to website or user. Today, any frequently updated information, such as blogs, news headlines, and podcasts, typically use RSS feeds for distribution. In 2000, the idea of attaching sound and video files to RSS feeds was being developed. In short order, audio blogging was born. More importantly, those same developers began toying with the idea of associating an RSS feed to an iPod feed, which ultimately would move MP3 files to iTunes. In 2003, a company called Audiofeast, later renamed Podbridge, had developed a method for providing episodic media, which enabled the user to download episodic audio content through desktop software and some portable devices. Around a year later, the first commercial podcast hosting service, audioblog.com, was launched, and has since, in its later branding, hosted hundreds of thousands of podcasts. The technology of the podcast arrives. Around 2004, the word podcast had entered common usage among the developer community, so much that by 2005, Apple added podcasting to its iTunes software and music store. That version of iTunes changed the landscape for podcasting. Provided a user had iTunes software on her or his computer, that user could subscribe to, download, and organize podcasts. Apple software eliminated much of the need for users to employ a separate aggregator application. iTunes did it all. At the same time, Apple was also promoting the creation of podcasts using its own software applications, GarageBand and QuickTime. This author's first commercial podcasts were developed and produced using those software applications at that time. The term podcast has officially moved from the techie world to the commons. Podcast was named the Word of the Year in 2005 by the New Oxford American Dictionary, and it was added to annual editions henceforth, starting in 2006. Even the President of the United States, then George W. Bush, became a de facto podcaster in 2005, as the White House website added an RSS feed to the President's weekly radio addresses. Although the technology for podcasting, production, and distribution was never limited, Apple's active entry into the world of podcasting around the middle of 2005 represented a defining moment. First, the company offered users a way of catching podcasts. Second, they published their podcast directory. And third, they enabled the creation of podcast content by providing software that included tutorials on how to create and upload a podcast. Of course, all this served to complement the landscape that featured Apple's 2001 introduction of something called an iPod, a portable digital audio player that sported a 5 gig capacity, jaw-dropping at that time. Yet the most compelling technology to change the landscape for podcasting has been the iPhone, Apple's smartphone first introduced in 2007. Smartphones had been under development since the 1990s, and the BlackBerry, which preceded Apple's product, was globally popular for many years. However, the iPhone integrated everything in a way that contributed not just to the blossoming of e-commerce, but to today's reality of using a smartphone as anything but a telephone, seamlessly accessing programs and episodes on a handheld device anywhere, at any time, has tapped into the ultimate authenticity of user experience. The proliferation of smartphones has steered the explosion of app development and availability. Pre-installed podcast apps have played an enormous role in the continued growth of podcasting, beginning around 2014. Other dedicated, highly user-friendly podcast apps, which will be discussed later, have appeared in podcast in app stores. Yet it is the development and global popularity of streaming and associated streaming platforms that opened the door to a more fully integrated user experience for finding, listening to, and even creating podcasts. Media and communications professor John L. Sullivan describes the importance and significance of mobile technology. He says, "Mobile consumption apps are critical to the infrastructure of podcasting because they provide a dual functionality as both tools of content discovery and consumption. Many of these apps are aligning themselves strategically and financially with discovery platforms to monetize their users' data. Podcast mobile apps offer their own forms of interactivity, sociability, and content curation by highlighting within the app a unique constellation of content specifically designed for users. Today, everyone has a podcast player in their pocket. More importantly, everyone has a microphone in their pocket. These technologies are groundbreaking. Perhaps more groundbreaking is the legitimacy now afforded to the world of podcasting. As of February 2025, the U.S. government opened the White House briefing room to podcasters, and in so doing created a dedicated seat in the first row for such media representatives. Now that tells us something about the impact and stature of podcasting. Someone once said that humans love to listen to each other talk. If that's true, we can thank some of the technology developers from the past 20 years or so. Or we could look back even further, and we can thank the ancient Greeks for their know-how in helping amplify and transmit the human voice.
Podcasting Explained, the audiobook, is a production of Henley Point. For more information visit henleypoint.ca.